The Tale of the Wazir and the Sage Duban. A king named Yunnan once ruled over the city of Fars in the land of Rum. He was a powerful and wealthy ruler who had armies and guards and allies from all nations. However, his body was afflicted with a leprosy that could not be healed by any leeches or scientists. He tried many remedies such as drinking potions, swallowing powders and using ointments, but none of them worked. Eventually, an experienced and wise healer named Duban came to the city and tried to cure him. This man was well educated, having read books from various cultures such as Greek, Persian, Roman, Arabian, and Syrian. He was an expert in fields such as astronomy and medicine, both in theory and practice. He was knowledgeable in the ways to heal and harm the body, familiar with the properties of every plant, grass, and herb, and understood their benefits and drawbacks. Additionally, he had a deep understanding of philosophy and had a thorough knowledge of medical science and other branches of knowledge. After arriving in the city, the physician soon heard about the king's leprosy and his physical suffering. He learned that all other doctors and wise men had been unable to heal him. So, he spent the night thinking deeply about it. When the morning came, he put on his best clothing and went to see King Yunnan. He greeted the king by bowing and kissing the ground before him. He then greeted the king in polite language and introduced himself, saying, "O king, I have heard about your condition and how other physicians were unable to heal you. I have come to tell you that I can cure you, and I will not require you to drink any potions or use any ointments." The king was surprised and asked the physician, "How will you do this?" King Yunnan replied, "By Allah, if you can cure me, I will make you very wealthy, give you generous gifts, and grant you any wish you have. You will be my companion and friend." The king then gave him an honorary robe and treated him kindly. He asked again, "Can you really cure me without drugs or ointments?" The physician replied, "Yes, I can heal you without the pain or side effects of medicine." The king was greatly surprised and asked, "When will this happen? How long will it take?" The physician replied, "I will begin the cure tomorrow." After that, the physician left the king's presence, and rented a house in the city where he could store his books, scrolls, medicines, and aromatic roots. He then started to carefully select the most appropriate drugs and herbs, and he crafted a bat with a hollow inside and a handle outside. He also made a ball. Both the bat and the ball were made with great skill and precision. The next day, when everything was ready, the physician went to see the king again. He greeted the king by bowing and kissing the ground, and then he asked the king to ride out to the parade ground to play Paul and Mall, a game similar to croquet, with him. He was accompanied by his entourage of emirs, chamberlains, wazirs, and other noblemen of the kingdom. Before the king could sit, the physician Duban came up to him and handed him the bat, saying, "Take this Mall and grip it as I do. Now push for the plain, and leaning well over thy horse drive the ball with all thy might until thy palm be moist and thy body perspire, then the medicine will penetrate through thy palm and will permeate thy person." The king took the bat from the physician and held it firmly. He mounted his horse and rode out to play Paul and Mall with the ball, galloping after it and striking it with all his might, while his hand held the bat handle. He continued playing until his hand was moist and his skin, perspiring, absorbed the medicine from the wood. After he was done playing, the physician told him to return to the palace, take a shower in the hammam bath and go to sleep. He promised that the king will become well. The physician Duban knew that the medicine had been absorbed by the king's body, so he told him to return to the palace immediately and take a shower in the hammam without delay. King Yunnan did as he was told, and ordered his servants to prepare the bath for him. They spread carpets and got everything ready as quickly as possible, including a change of clothing for the king. King Yunnan followed the physician's instructions and entered the hammam to take a long and thorough shower. He changed into fresh clothes inside the hammam, then rode back to his palace where he lay down and slept. As for the physician Duban, he went back home and slept as usual. The next morning, he went to the palace to seek an audience with the king. The king ordered him to be admitted, and after Duban greeted the king by bowing and kissing the ground, he recited a poem with a serious tone. The poem praises the king's eloquence and presence, and wishes that his face will always shine like the dawn and never be clouded by anger. The poet also mentions that the king's generosity and wealth have helped him to achieve great things and reach the heights of grandeur. After the sage finished speaking, the king quickly stood up and embraced him. He then sat him next to him and ordered for him to be given a luxurious outfit. This was because, when the king left the bathhouse, he examined his body and saw that there was no sign of leprosy remaining. The king was overjoyed to find that his skin was now as clean as newly minted silver. He was filled with happiness and his chest expanded with delight. When it was daylight, he went to his audience hall and sat on his throne. His chamberlains and high-ranking officials came to see him, along with the sage Dubon. When the king saw Dubon, he stood up to show him respect and invited him to sit next to him. Then, the most delicious food was brought in on trays and Dubon ate with the king. He did not leave the king's company for the entire day. In addition, as evening approached, the king gave Dubon 2,000 gold pieces in addition to a ceremonial outfit and many other gifts. He also sent him home on a horse of his own. After Dubon had left, King Yunnan expressed his amazement at Dubon's medical skills once again, saying, "This man treated me without applying any ointments or medicaments. I swear by Allah, this is truly a masterful skill. I am obligated to reward and show distinction to such a man, and I will make him my companion and friend for the rest of my days." King Yunnan was filled with joy and happiness that his body was healed and was free from the serious illness. The next day, he left his palace and sat on his throne. His nobles were around him, and his emirs and ministers were seated on his right and left as usual. He then called for Dubon, who entered and bowed before him. The king stood up to greet him and invited him to sit next to him. They ate together and the king wished Dubon a long life. In addition, the king honored and provided gifts to the physician, and they continued their conversation until nightfall. As a form of payment, the king gave the physician 5 ceremonial robes and 1,000 gold coins. The physician returned to his home filled with gratitude towards the king. The following morning, the king went to his audience hall where his nobles, chamberlains, and ministers gathered around him, like the whites surrounding the pupil of an eye. The king had a minister among his advisors, who was unattractive in appearance and had a negative aura. He was also stingy, envious and filled with malice. When this minister saw the king showing favor to the physician and giving him gifts, he became jealous and planned to harm the physician. As the saying goes, envy is present in everyone, and oppression lies in every heart. Power reveals it and weakness conceals it. He then approached the king and, after kissing the ground before him, said, "O king of all ages, in whose benefits I have grown to adulthood, I have important advice to offer you. If I were to keep it to myself, I would be a son of adultery and not a true-born man. Therefore, if you command me to reveal it, I will do so immediately." The king, who was troubled by the minister's words, asked, "What is this advice of yours?" The minister replied, "O glorious monarch, the wise of old have said." When it was the 5th night, her sister said, "Please finish your story for us, if you are not tired," and she resumed, "It has reached me, O fortunate king and powerful monarch, that King Yunnan said to his minister, 'O minister, you have been possessed by the evil spirit of envy because of this physician, and you plot for my putting him to death, after which I would regret it deeply, just as King Sinbad regretted killing his falcon.'" The minister asked, "Pardon me, O king of the age, what happened with that?" So the king began the story of King Sinbad and his falcon. It is said, but Allah is all-knowing, that there was a king of the kings of Fars, who enjoyed pleasure and entertainment, particularly hunting and falconry. He had raised a falcon that he carried on his fist all night, and whenever he went hunting, he took this bird with him. He also had a golden couplet made for her to hang around her neck so that she could drink from it. One day, as the king was sitting quietly in his palace, the chief falconer of the household suddenly said to him, "O king of the age, this is indeed a day fit for hunting." The king gave orders accordingly and set out, taking the hawk on his fist, and they went forward happily until they reached a valley where they set up a circle of nets for hunting. Suddenly, a gazelle came within the traps and the king cried out, "Anyone who allows that gazelle to jump over their head and loses her, that person I will surely slay." They narrowed the nets around the gazelle as she drew near the king's station, and, planting herself on her hindquarters, crossed her forelegs over her chest, as if about to kiss the earth before the king. He lowered his head in submission to the beast and it bounded high over his head and ran off into the wilderness. Thereupon the king turned towards his troops and seeing them winking and pointing at him, he asked, "O minister, what are my men saying?" The minister replied, "They say that you proclaim that anyone who allows the gazelle to jump over their head would be put to death." The king said, "Now, by the life of my head, I will follow her until I bring her back." So he set off galloping after the gazelle's trail and did not stop tracking it until he reached the foothills of a mountain range where the quarry entered a cave. Then the king released the falcon, which caught it up and, swooping down, drove its talons into its eyes, bewildering and blinding it. The king drew his mace and struck a blow that rolled the game over. He then dismounted, and after cutting the antelope's throat and flaying the body, hung it on the pommel of his saddle. Now the time was that of the siesta, and the wilderness was parched and dry, with no water to be found anywhere. The king was thirsty and his horse too, so he searched until he saw a tree that was dripping water, as if it were melted butter, from its branches. The king, who wore gauntlets of skin to protect himself from poison, took the cup from the hawk's neck and filled it with the water, and set it before the bird. But the falcon struck it with her talons and overturned the liquid. The king filled it a second time with the dripping drops, thinking his hawk was thirsty, but the bird again struck at the cup with her talons and overturned it. Then the king became angry with the hawk and filled the cup a third time, offered it to his horse, but the hawk upset it with a flick of its wings. The king said, "May Allah curse you, you unlucky bird. You keep me from drinking, and you deprive yourself, and the horse." So he struck the falcon with his sword and cut off its wing, but the bird raised her head and indicated with signs, "Look at what hangs on the tree." The king looked up and saw a group of vipers, whose poison drops he mistook for water. Then he regretted having struck off his falcon's wing, and mounted his horse and returned with the dead gazelle to the camp. He threw the quarry to the cook and said, "Take and cook it," and sat down on his chair, with the falcon still on his fist, when suddenly the bird gasped and died. The king cried out in sorrow and remorse for having killed that falcon that had saved his life. Now this is what happened in the case of King Sinbad, and I am sure that if I were to do as you desire, I would regret it just as the man who killed his parrot. The minister asked, "And what happened with that?" And the king began to tell the tale of the husband and the parrot. A certain man, who was also a merchant, had married a beautiful wife, a woman of perfect beauty and grace, symmetry and loveliness, whom he was extremely jealous of, and she managed to prevent him from traveling. Eventually, an opportunity came up that compelled him to leave her, so he went to the bird market and bought a female parrot for 100 gold pieces, which he put in his house to act as a chaperone, expecting her to tell him upon his return everything that had happened during the entire time of his absence, because the bird was smart and cunning and never forgot what she had seen and heard. His beautiful wife had fallen in love with a young Turk, who used to visit her, and she would entertain him during the day and sleep with him at night. When the man returned from his trip and wanted to know what had happened during his absence, he brought the parrot to him and asked her about the conduct of his wife. She said, "Your wife had a male friend who spent every night with her during your absence." The husband became angry and severely beat his wife. The woman, suspecting that one of the slave girls had told her husband, called them together and questioned them under oath. They all swore that they had kept the secret, but that the parrot had not, and they said, "We heard her with our own ears." The woman instructed one of the girls to place a hand mill under the cage and use it to grind, another to sprinkle water on the cage's roof, and a third to run around with a brightly polished steel mirror all through the night. When the husband returned home from a friend's house the next morning, he asked the parrot what had happened while he was away. The parrot replied, "Forgive me, my master, I couldn't hear or see anything due to the intense darkness and thunder and lightning that lasted throughout the night." As it happened to be the summer season, the master was shocked and exclaimed, "But we are now in mid-Tammuz, and this is not the time for rains and storms." The bird replied, "Yes, by Allah, I saw with these eyes what my tongue has told you." The man, not understanding the situation and not suspecting any deceit, became extremely angry, and, believing that his wife had been falsely accused, reached out and pulled the parrot from her cage and dashed her to the ground with such force that she died on the spot. A few days later, one of his slave girls confessed the whole truth to him, but he did not believe it until he saw the young Turk, his wife's lover, coming out of her chamber. He drew his sword and killed him by a blow to the back of the neck. He did the same to the adulteress, and as a result, the two, burdened with mortal sin, went straight to eternal fire. After realizing that the parrot had told him the truth about everything she had seen, the merchant grieved deeply for her loss, but it was too late. The minister, upon hearing the words of King Yunan, replied, "O monarch, high in dignity, what harm have I done him, or what evil have I seen from him that I should plan his death? I would not do this thing, except to serve you, and soon you will see that it is right. If you follow my advice, you will be saved, Otherwise, you will be destroyed, just like a certain minister who acted treacherously towards a young prince." The king asked, "What happened?" And the minister began to tell his story. The tale of the prince and the ogress. A certain king had a son who was very fond of hunting and chasing. He ordered one of his ministers to accompany him wherever he went. One day, the youth set out for the hunt with his father's minister. As they traveled together, a big wild animal appeared in sight. The minister shouted to the king's son to go after it. The prince followed the animal until he was lost from sight and the chase got away from him in the wilderness. He became confused and didn't know which way to turn, when a damsel appeared in front of him and she was crying. The king's son asked her, "Who are you?" And she replied, "I am the daughter of a king among the kings of Hind. I was traveling with a caravan in the desert when I fell asleep and fell off my beast. Now I am cut off from my people and very lost." The prince, feeling sorry for her, put her on the back of his horse and traveled until they passed by an old ruin. The damsel told him, "Oh my master, I need to answer the call of nature." He therefore set her down at the ruin where she delayed so long that the king's son thought she was wasting time, so he followed her without her knowledge. He saw that she was a ghoula, a wicked ogress, who was saying to her children, "Oh my children, today I bring you a nice plump young man for dinner." To which they replied, "Bring him quickly to us, O our mother, so we can eat him." The prince, hearing their conversation, knew he was going to die and his side muscles quivered in fear for his life, so he turned away and was about to flee. The ghoula came out and seeing him in great fear, cried, "Why are you afraid?" He replied, "I have encountered an enemy whom I fear greatly." The ghoula asked, "Didn't you say that you are a king's son?" He answered, "Yes." She said, "Why don't you give your enemy some money and satisfy him?" He replied, "He will not be satisfied with my money but only with my life, and I fear him greatly and I am a man under oppression." She replied, "If you are as distressed as you say, ask for help against him from Allah, who will surely protect you from his harm and the evil you fear." Then the prince raised his eyes to the heavens and cried, "O thou who answers the needy when they call upon thee and dispels their distress, O my God, grant me victory over my enemy and turn him away from me, for thou art almighty over all things." The ghoula, hearing his prayer, turned away from him, and the prince returned to his father and told him the story of the minister. The king summoned the minister to his presence and killed him on the spot. If you continue to trust this leech, you will also die the worst of deaths. The person whom you have made much of and treated as an intimate, will cause your destruction. Don't you see how he healed your disease from the outside of your body by something grasped in your hand? Don't be sure that he won't also destroy you by something held in the same way. King Yunnan replied, "You have spoken the truth, O minister, it may well be as you hint. O my well-advised minister, and perhaps this sage has come as a spy trying to put me to death, for surely, if he cured me by something held in my hand, he can kill me by something given to me to smell." Then King Yunnan asked, "O minister, what should be done with him?" The minister answered, "Send for him immediately and summon him to your presence, and when he comes, strike him across the neck, and thus you will get rid of him and his wickedness, and deceive him before he can deceive you." "You have spoken the truth again, O minister," said the king and sent someone to call the sage, who came in a joyful mood, for he did not know what the Compassionate had appointed for him. As a certain poet said by way of illustration, this is a poem that is conveying that one should trust in fate and wait. What fate says will happen, and one should trust in the creator of the world. The person is saying that if one fears fate, they should go on with confidence and leave everything to fate. One will be safe from what is not yet decreed by fate. As Duban the physician entered, he addressed the king with these lines. Duban the physician recites poetry to King Yunnan, expressing his gratitude to the king for the gifts he bestowed on him, and encouraging the king to trust in fate, let go of the past, enjoy the present and not to worry about the future. He also advises the king to trust in Allah's will and not to oppose it. Lastly, he suggests to the king to forget his griefs, not to let them weigh him down and to be wise and avoid foolish thoughts. The king replied, "Do you know why I have summoned you?" The sage replied, "Allah alone knows hidden things." But the king retorted, "I summoned you only to take your life and completely destroy you." Duban the wise was extremely surprised by this strange statement and asked, "O king, why would you want to kill me, and what wrong have I done you?" The king answered, "People tell me that you are a spy sent here to kill me, and now I will kill you before you can kill me." He then called to his swordsman and said, "Strike off the head of this traitor and deliver us from his evil practices." The sage said, "Spare me, and Allah will spare you. Don't kill me, or Allah will kill you." He repeated these words to the king, "Even as I have to you, O Ifrit, but you still wanted to kill me." King Yunnan only replied, "I will not be safe unless I kill you, because, as you healed me with something held in my hand, I am not secure against you killing me with something given to me to smell or otherwise." The physician said, "This then, O king, is your gratitude and reward, you are returning only evil for good." The king replied, "There is no help for it, you must die and without delay." Now when the physician knew that the king would kill him without delay, he wept and regretted doing good to others, as one has said on this subject. The poem recited by Duban the physician is expressing that wisdom is the key to success and avoiding failure, and he regrets for being kind to others, and that kindness led him to his own downfall. He says that if he lives, he will never be kind again, and if he dies, he curses those who follow his example and wish them the same fate. The swordsman then stepped forward, bound Duban's eyes and bared his blade, saying to the king, "With your permission," while the physician wept and cried, "Spare me and Allah will spare you. Don't kill me, or Allah will kill you." He repeats this warning, as he has done before, but the king remains determined to kill him. Duban the physician is now certain that the king is going to kill him, and he pleads with the king to spare him, reminding him that if he does so, Allah will spare him. He also tells the king that he has not sinned against him and has only done good, by healing him from a disease that no other leech or scientist could cure. One of the king's favorites speaks up and pleads for Duban's life, but the king insists that if he spares Duban, he will doom himself to certain death. Duban then asks for a little delay, so that he can go to his house and release himself from his obligations and direct his family and neighbors where to bury him and distribute his books of medicine. He also offers the king a book of medicine, that is a rare treasure, that contains secrets. He tells the king that if he opens 3 leaves and reads 3 lines of the page to his left hand, after cutting off his head will speak and answer every question the king wants to ask. The king is intrigued by Duban's claim that his head will speak after it is cut off and allows him to go home to settle his obligations. The next day, Duban comes back to the king's audience hall, where many important people are gathered, and presents the king with a worn old book and a small metal container full of powder. He asks for a tray and pours the powder onto it, and tells the king that after his head is cut off, he should place it on the tray and press it down onto the powder. He explains that this will stop the blood flow. The king and all the people present are amazed and curious about what will happen next. The king followed Duban's instructions and placed the head on the tray of powder, and the blood stopped flowing. Duban then instructed the king to open the book, but when he did, he found that the pages were stuck together. As he turned over each page, he discovered that there was no writing on them. Duban told him to keep turning pages, and eventually, the king reached the poison pages of the book. As the poison took effect, the king fell into convulsions and cried out that the poison had done its work. At this point, Duban's head began to speak, improvising a poem or speech. The king, who had been foolishly tempted by the promise of a talking head, realized too late that he had been betrayed by the physician Duban. He was now suffering from the effects of the poison book, and the physician's head continued to recite poetry, emphasizing the moral that those who rule unjustly will eventually be punished by fate. The king's actions of mistrust and cruelty ultimately led to his own downfall. When it was the 6th night, the fisherman had captured an Ifrit, a powerful demon, and the demon's sister, Dunyazad, asked him to finish his story. The king gave him permission to continue, and the fisherman recounted how he had captured the Ifrit and planned to kill it by throwing it into the sea. The Ifrit begged for mercy and pardon for its past actions, and quoted a saying about being kind to those who have done evil, and not to treat them as someone named Umama treated Attica. The Ifrit told the fisherman that he would tell the story of Umama and Attica if he was set free. But the fisherman refused and said that there was no way for the Ifrit to escape and that he had done him no harm and that he had helped him in the past by releasing him from jail. The fisherman refused the Ifrit's request and said that he knew the Ifrit was an evildoer and that he would warn anyone who caught him in the future to throw him back into the sea again and he will be trapped there until the end of time. However, the Ifrit pleaded again and promised not to harm him, instead he will help him to never want for anything. The fisherman finally agreed to release the Ifrit on the condition that he will not cause trouble again and instead will do him service, and made the Ifrit swear an oath to that effect. After the fisherman opened the jar, the smoke rose up and turned into an Ifrit, who immediately kicked the jar into the sea. The fisherman, Seeing how the Ifrit had treated the jar and fearing for his own safety, he wet his pants and thought to himself that this didn't look good. He still tried to fortify himself and reminded the Ifrit of the promise he made and the oath he swore, that he will not harm him or play him false, as Allah is a jealous God who will not let the sinner escape. He also reminded the Ifrit of the story of the sage Duban and King Yunnan. The Ifrit laughed and walked away, telling the fisherman to follow him, and the fisherman followed him cautiously, at a safe distance, until they passed through the outskirts of the city. They then headed to a wilderness and came across a mountain lake. The Ifrit walked into the middle of the lake and told the fisherman to follow him. He then stood in the center of the lake and told the fisherman to cast his net and catch fish. The fisherman was surprised to see different colored fishes in the lake: white, red, blue, and yellow. He casted his net and caught 4 fishes, one of each color. The fisherman was very pleased, and even more so when the Ifrit told him to take the fish to the Sultan and put them in his presence. He will then be rewarded with wealth. He also instructed him to fish here only once a day. The Ifrit then said goodbye and struck the ground with his foot, causing it to open and swallow him. The fisherman, still in amazement of what had happened, took the fish and went home. He filled an earthen bowl with water and put the fish in it, which began to swim and wriggle around. He then put the bowl on his head and went to the king's palace and presented the fish to the king as the Ifrit had instructed him. The king was very surprised and had never seen fish like this before. He ordered the fish to be given to the new slave girl who was working as a cook in the palace. The king of Rum had sent her 3 days ago, and he had not yet had a chance to test her cooking skills. The prime minister gave the fish to the cook and instructed her to fry them, and also told her that the king had sent them and wanted her to prepare them. He also told her that the king has kept her with him for this specific moment and asked her to show her cooking skills and make the dish taste delicious, as the fish was a present sent to the sultan and is a rarity. The prime minister then went back to the king and reported the cook. The king then ordered the prime minister to give the fisherman 400 gold coins as a reward, which he did, and the fisherman went home in shock and disbelief, thinking it was all a dream. He used the money to buy everything his family needed, and went home to his wife, overjoyed and happy. As for the cook, she cleaned the fish and put them in a frying pan and cooked them, basting them with oil until they were cooked on one side. Then she flipped them over, and at that moment, the wall of the kitchen split open, and out came a beautiful young lady, with a perfect figure, an oval face, and eyelids lined with kohl. She was wearing a silk head scarf, fringed and tasseled with blue. She had a large ring hanging from each ear, bracelets on her wrists, and rings with precious gemstones on her fingers. She was holding a long rod of rattan cane, and she used it to poke the fish in the frying pan and said, "Oh fish! Oh fish! Be true to your promise." Upon seeing this, the cook fainted. The young lady repeated her words again and again, and finally, the fish raised their heads from the pan and spoke in a clear voice, saying yes, yes, and then reciting a verse. The verse they recited was, "Come back and so will I. Keep faith and so will I. And if ye fain forsake, I'll requite till quits we cry." After that, the young lady overturned the frying pan and left the way she came in, and the kitchen wall closed behind her. When the cook regained consciousness, she saw the 4 fish were charred and blackened like charcoal, and she cried out, "His staff broke in his first bout." The prime minister came to get the fish, and when he saw the cook unconscious and unresponsive, he gave her a little kick with his foot, and said, "Bring the fish for the sultan." When she came to, she cried and told him what had happened and all that occurred to her. The prime minister was very surprised and said, "This is a very strange matter." He then sent for the fisherman and asked him to bring 4 more fishes like the ones he had brought before. The fisherman went to the lake, cast his net and caught 4 fish exactly like the first. He brought them to the prime minister, who took them to the cook and asked her to fry them in his presence so that he could see what happened. The cook got up and cleaned the fish and put them in the frying pan over the fire. But they were only there for a short while before the wall split open and the young lady appeared again, wearing the same clothes as before and holding the wand in her hand. She poked the fish in the frying pan again and said, "Oh fish! Oh fish! Be true to your old promise?" The fish raised their heads and said yes, yes, and recited a couplet. The couplet they recited was, "Come back and so will I. Keep faith and so will I. But if ye fain forsake, I'll requite till quits we cry." And Shahrazad realized that dawn had arrived and stopped her storytelling for the day. When it was the 7th night, she continued her story, "O king, that when the fish spoke and the young lady overturned the frying pan with her wand and left through the same way she came in and the wall closed behind her, the Prime Minister exclaimed this is something that should not be kept hidden from the king. So, he went to the king and told him what had happened. The king said, I must see this with my own eyes. He then summoned the fisherman and ordered him to bring 4 more fish like the first and to bring 3 men as witnesses. The fisherman promptly brought the fish and the king, after giving him 400 gold coins, turned to the Prime Minister and said fry the fish for me here in front of me. The minister replied to hear is to obey and ordered to bring the frying pan, put the cleaned fish in it and put it over the fire. Suddenly the wall split open and a black slave appeared, who looked like a huge rock or a member of the tribe Ad. He was holding a branch of a green tree in his hand and he shouted in a loud and terrifying voice, "Oh fish! Oh fish! Are you all true to your old promise?" The fish lifted their heads from the frying pan and said, "Yes. Yes. We are true to our vow," and they recited the couplet again, "Come back and so will I. Keep faith and so will I. But if ye fain forsake, I'll requite till quits we cry." Then the big black slave approached the frying pan and overturned it with the branch and left the way he came in. When he disappeared from their sight, the king looked at the fish and saw that they were all charred and blackened like charcoal and he was very confused. He said to the Prime Minister, "Indeed, this is a matter that cannot be kept secret. And these fish, there must be something extraordinary about them." He ordered to bring the fisherman and asked him, "Where did you get these fish from?" The fisherman replied, "From a lake between 4 mountains located behind this mountain that can be seen from your city." The king asked, "How far is it?" The fisherman replied, "My lord Sultan, it's a half-hour walk." The king was amazed, and immediately ordered his soldiers to march and his horsemen to ride, with the fisherman leading the way as a guide. He secretly cursed the Ifrit. They traveled until they reached the mountain, and descended into a large desert that they had never seen before in their lives. The Sultan and his men were amazed by the wild landscape surrounded by 4 mountains, and the lake with its fish of 4 colors, red, white, yellow and blue. The king was amazed and asked his troops and everyone present, "Has anyone among you ever seen this body of water before now?" And all of them answered, "O king of the age, we have never seen it before in our lives." They also asked the oldest inhabitants they met, the elderly men, but they replied, each and every one, "We have never seen a lake like this in this place." Therefore the king said, "By Allah, I will not return to my capital or sit on the throne of my ancestors until I find out the truth about this lake and the fish in it." He then ordered his men to dismount and set up camp all around the mountain. He summoned his prime minister, an experienced, wise and well-informed official, and said to him, "I have decided to do something and I will tell you about it. I have a feeling that I should go out alone tonight and discover the mystery of this lake and its fish. The Prime Minister must sit at the entrance of his tent and tell the emirs, wazirs, officials and chamberlains that the Sultan was feeling unwell, and that he has ordered him to deny entry to anyone. He must also make sure that no one knows about the king's plan." The Prime Minister could not object to the king's decision. As he continued to walk, the black point grew larger and closer, until he finally reached a cave that was deep and dark. He entered the cave and began to explore, and as he walked, he saw a light that grew brighter and brighter until he reached a large chamber. He then pushed open the door and found himself in a great hall, with a throne of gold in the midst, and on either side thereof a bench of silver. He looked around and saw no one, so he advanced to the throne and sat down upon it. And behold, the palace was shaken and trembled, and there came forth a smoke which filled the hall. Suddenly, the smoke cleared, revealing an old man with a long beard, who was sitting on the bench. He said to the king, "Welcome, O king. What brought thee to this place, and what is thy need?" The king was amazed and told the old man the story of the tarn and the fish and how he had come seeking the truth. The old man smiled and said, "Verily, this is a strange tale, but I will explain it all to you." And he proceeded to tell the king the true story behind the tarn and the fish, revealing that it was all a magical spell cast by a powerful sorcerer. The king listened attentively and thanked the old man for his explanation before returning to his kingdom. He then began to explore the palace and found it to be filled with all manner of treasures and precious stones, as well as beautiful furnishings and decorations. He also discovered that there were many rooms and chambers, but they were all empty and no sign of any inhabitants. The king was both perplexed and amazed at what he saw, and he began to wonder about the purpose of this palace and why it was abandoned. He decided to spend the night in the palace and continue his investigation the next day. As he explored the palace further, he began to uncover the secrets of the tarn and its fish, and the strange occurrences that had been happening in his city. He saw also in it all manner of goods and ornaments and rarities, vessels of gold and silver, and all that a king could desire. And he wondered at the palace and its people, and said to himself, "Peradventure the people of the palace have gone out to some festival or other and left the palace open, and their goods and gear exposed." So he went round about the palace and saw in it 4 saloons, one above the other, and in each saloon 4 chambers, and in each chamber 4 couches, and on each couch a damsel, who was as it were a piece of the moon, and each damsel was adorned with the fairest of apparel and ornaments. He marveled at the sight and said, "Praise be Allah who hath bestowed on me all this good." And he went into one of the damsels and found her asleep, so he looked at her and saw that she was fair as a pearl and as a sunbeam, and her beauty and loveliness were as they were in a picture. And he said, "This damsel is fairer than the other damsels and more beautiful and more perfect in symmetry." And he went into her and sat by her head, and shook her gently till she awoke and opened her eyes, whereupon she raised her head and seeing a man sitting by her side, she shrieked a great shriek and swooned away. The poet describes a young man with a slender waist, whose hair and forehead are striking. The world appears both dark and light in contrast to him. He is the most beautiful thing in the world, with a dark mole on his rosy cheek, and dark eyes. The king was pleased and greeted him, but the man remained seated wearing a silk robe trimmed with gold from Egypt and a crown adorned with various jewels. Despite the finery, his face appeared to be upset and showed signs of grief. He politely returned the king's greeting, saying, "My lord, your status requires me to stand for you, and my only excuse is to ask for your forgiveness." The king replied, "You are excused, young man. Consider me as your guest who has come here for a specific purpose. I would like you to tell me about the secrets of this lake and its fish, as well as about this palace and your solitude here, and the reason for your crying and wailing." When the young man heard these words, he cried so much that his chest was drenched with tears and he began reciting a poem. Tell those who sleep without a care while the arrow of fate flies by. How many people this constantly changing world has brought low and raised up. Even if your eyes are closed in sleep, the eyes of the Almighty remain open. And who has ever found time to be fair or fate to be constant? He then took a deep sigh and recited a poem. Entrust your situation to the Lord who created humanity. Leave behind worries and cultivate contentment. Don't question the past or how or why it happened. All human things were designed by fate and destiny. The king was surprised and asked him, "What is making you cry, young man?" And he replied, "How could I not cry when this is my condition?" Then he revealed by lifting the lower part of his clothing that half of his body was made of stone, from his feet to the navel, while the other half, from the navel to the head, was human. The king, upon seeing this state of the young man, felt deep sympathy and said, "Alas! Truly, young man, your suffering adds to my own sorrow. I had intended to ask you only about the mystery of the fish, but now I am concerned to learn about your story as well as theirs. But there is no power or might except with Allah, the glorious and great. Please do not waste any time, young man, but tell me your entire story right away." The young man said, "Please lend me your ears, eyes, and understanding," and the king replied, "All of them are at your service." The young man then began, "My case and that of these fish are truly amazing and extraordinary, and if it were engraved with engravers on the corners of the eyes, it would serve as a warning to whoever wants to be warned." "What do you mean?" asked the king, and the young man began to explain. The Tale of the Ensorcelled Prince. You should know, my lord, that my father was once the king of this city and his name was Mahmud. He was known as the Lord of the Black Islands and owned what are now these 4 mountains. He ruled for 70 years, after which he passed away and I succeeded him as the Sultan. I married my cousin, the daughter of my father's brother, and she loved me so deeply that whenever I was away, she wouldn't eat or drink until she saw me again. We lived together for 5 years, until one day she went to the hammam bath, and I instructed the cook to prepare everything for our dinner. I entered this palace, lay down on the bed where I usually sleep and told 2 ladies to fan my face, one sitting by my head and the other at my feet. However, I was troubled by my wife's absence and could not fall asleep. Although my eyes were closed, my mind and thoughts were wide awake. Suddenly, I heard the slave girl at my head say to the one at my feet, "O Masuda, how miserable our master is and how he's wasting his youth, and oh, the pity of him being betrayed by our mistress, the cursed whore." The other replied, Yes indeed, may Allah curse all unfaithful women and adulterers. But our master, with his good looks and qualities, deserves someone better than this whore who lies with other men every night." Then the one sitting by my head said, "Is our Lord dumb or only good for nothing that he doesn't question her about it?" The other replied, "Shame on you. Does our Lord know her ways or does she give him a choice? No, she also drugs the cup of wine she gives him to drink before bed every night, and puts bhang into it. So he sleeps and doesn't know where she goes or what she does. But we know that after giving him the drugged wine, she puts on her most luxurious clothes and perfumes herself and then leaves him until morning. Then she comes back to him, burns incense under his nose and he wakes up from his death-like sleep." When I heard the slave girl's words, my sight became dark and I thought night would never fall. Soon, my cousin returned from the baths and they prepared the table for us and we ate and sat together for a good half-hour drinking our wine as we used to do. Then she called for the special wine I used to drink before sleeping and handed me the cup, but I pretended to drink it as usual, but instead I poured it into my chest, and pretending to sleep, let her think I was asleep. Then, behold, she cried, "Sleep out the night, and never wake again. By Allah, I loathe thee and I loathe thy whole body, and my soul turneth in disgust from cohabiting with thee, and I see not the moment when Allah shall snatch away thy life." Then she rose and donned her fairest dress and perfumed her person and slung my sword over her shoulder, and, opening the gates of the palace, went her away. I got up and followed her as she left the palace and she walked through the streets until she reached the city gate. There, she spoke words I did not understand and the locks on the gate opened by themselves as if they were broken, and the gates opened. She went outside, and I followed her without her noticing, until she finally reached the outer mounds and a reed fence surrounding a round, mud brick hut. As she entered the door, I climbed onto the roof, which gave me a view of the interior, and saw that my beautiful cousin had gone inside to a hideous Negro slave with an upper lip like the cover of a pot, and lower lip like an open pot, lips that could sweep up sand from the gravel floor of the cottage. He was also a leper and a paralytic, lying on a pile of sugarcane waste and wrapped in an old blanket and the dirtiest rags. She kissed the ground before him, and he raised his head to look at her and said, "Woe to you! Why did you stay away so long? Some of the black brothers came here and drank their wine, each with his own young lady, and I was not satisfied to drink because of your absence." Then she said, "O my lord, my heart's love and the light of my eyes, don't you know that I am married to my cousin whom I despise, and I hate myself when I'm in his company? And if I didn't fear for your sake, I would not let a single sun rise before destroying his city, making it a ruined heap where ravens croak and owls hoot, and jackals and wolves would live and loot. I would have removed every stone of it to the backside of Mount Kaf." The slave replied, "You are lying, damn you. Now I swear an oath by the courage and honor of black men, and do not think our masculinity is the poor masculinity of white men. From today on, if you stay away until this hour, I will not keep company with you, nor will I glue my body with yours, and play in bump bellies. Do you play fast and loose with us, you cracked pot, so we can satisfy your dirty desires? Stinkard. Bitch. The vilest of the vile whites." When I heard his words and saw with my own eyes what was happening between these two wretched people, the world became dark before my eyes and my soul did not know where it was. But my wife stood up humbly, weeping before and pleading with the slave, saying, "O my beloved, in the very fruit of my heart, there is no one left for me but yourself, and if you reject me, who will accept me, O my beloved, O light of my eyes?" She didn't stop crying and humbling herself to him until he agreed to reconcile with her. Then she was very happy and stood up and took off her clothes, even down to her underpants, and said, "O my master, what do you have here for your maidservant to eat?" "Uncover the basin," he grumbled, "and you'll find some broiled rat bones at the bottom. Pick at them and then go to that slop pot where you'll find some leftover beer, which you can drink." She ate and drank and washed her hands, and went and lay down next to the slave, on the pile of sugarcane waste, and stripping herself completely naked, she lay down next to him under his filthy blanket and rags. When I saw my wife, my cousin, the daughter of my uncle, do this deed, I completely lost my mind, and climbing down from the roof, I entered and picked up the sword which she had with her and drew it, determined to kill both of them. I first struck at the slave's neck and thought that the death sentence had been passed on him. And Shahrazad perceived the dawn of day and ceased to say her permitted say. When it was the 8th night, she continued, it reached me, O fortunate king, that the young enchanted prince said to the king, When I struck the slave with the intention of cutting off his head, I thought I had killed him, because he made a loud hissing groan, but I had only cut the skin and flesh of the throat and the 2 arteries. It woke up my uncle's daughter, so I put away the sword and left for the city. Entering the palace, I lay down on my bed and slept until morning, when my wife woke me up and I saw that she had cut off her hair and had put on mourning clothes. She said, "O son of my uncle, do not blame me for what I am doing. It has just reached me that my mother is dead, my father has been killed in a holy war, one of my brothers has died from a snake bite and the other from falling off a precipice, and I can and should do nothing but weep and lament." When I heard her words, I refrained from any reproach and said only, "Do as you please, I will certainly not oppose you." She continued to grieve, weep and wail for an entire year, from the start of the year to the end, and when it was finished she said to me, "I want to build a tomb with a dome in your palace, which I will set aside for my mourning and will name the House of Lamentations." I said again, "Do as you please." Then she built for herself a cenotaph where she would mourn, and placed a dome in the center under which was a tomb, similar to a holy man's sepulchre. She brought the slave there and put him in that place, but he was very weak due to his wound and was unable to fulfill her sexual needs. He could only drink wine, and from the day of his injury, he didn't speak a word, but he lived on because his time to die had not come yet. Every day, morning and evening, my wife went to him and wept and wailed over him, gave him wine and strong soups, and didn't stop doing this for another year, and I was patient and didn't pay attention to her. But one day, I went to her unexpectedly, and I found her weeping, hitting her face and crying. "Speak to me, O my life, talk with me, O my love." Then she recited these verses. "For your love my patience fails, and albeit you forget I may not, nor to other love my heart can make reply. Bear my body, bear my soul wheresoever you may fare, and where you pitch the camp let my body buried lie. Cry my name above my grave, and an answer shall return the moaning of my bones responsive to your cry." Then she recited, weeping bitterly the while, "The day of my delight is the day when draw you near, and the day of mine affright is the day you turn away. Though I tremble through the night in my bitter dread of death, when I hold you in my arms I am free from all affray." Once more she began reciting, "Though a morn I may awake with all happiness in hand, though the world all be mine, and like Kisra kings I reign. To me they had the worth of the winglet of the gnat, when I fail to see thy form, when I look for thee in vain. Speak to me, O my life, talk with me, O my love." Then she recited these verses. "For your love my patience fails, and albeit you forget I may not, nor to other love my heart can make reply. Bear my body, bear my soul wheresoever you may fare, and where you pitch the camp let my body buried lie. Cry my name above my grave, and an answer shall return the moaning of my bones responsive to your cry." Then she recited, weeping bitterly the while, "The day of my delight is the day when draw you near, and the day of mine affright is the day you turn away. Though I tremble through the night in my bitter dread of death, when I hold you in my arms I am free from all affray." Once more she began reciting, "Though a morn I may awake with all happiness in hand, though the world all be mine, and like Kisra kings I reign. To me they had the worth of the winglet of the gnat, when I fail to see thy form, when I look for thee in vain." Then one day, I went into her again, and found her weeping and reciting poetry, and she said to me, "O my cousin, verily my heart is broken, and I can no longer bear the thought of living without my love. I beg of thee, by Allah, to grant me a last wish, and bury me with him in the tomb in the House of Lamentations." I saw that her determination was fixed and that she would not be dissuaded, so I granted her wish and buried her with him in the tomb. And thus, my lord, is the story of my wife and her love for the slave, and the cause of my sorrow and my being turned into stone from the waist down. I never heard thee vouchsafe a single word to me, O my lord. Why don't you respond to me, O my master? And she began to recite, "O, you tomb! O, you tomb! Be his beauty hidden in the shadows? Hast thou darkened that countenance to the sheen of noon? O, you tomb! How come my sun and moon are conjoined in thee, when neither earth nor heaven are to me?" When I heard such verses, my rage was heaped upon my rage, and I exclaimed, "Well away! How long will this agony last?" And I started saying, "O, you tomb! O, you tomb! Be his horrors writ large? Have you darkened his countenance, which sickens the soul? O, you tomb! Then how cometh it in thee are conjoined soil and coal, neither cesspool nor pipkin?" When she heard my words, she jumped to her feet and cried, "Fie upon thee, thou cur! All of this is due to thy actions. Thou hast wounded my heart's darling, causing me great grief, and thou hast wasted his youth, causing him to lie in bed more dead than alive for 3 years. In my rage, I yelled, O thou foulest of harlots and filthiest of whores ever fuddled by Negro slaves hired to have at thee. Yes, it was I who did this good deed, and I drew my sword and charged at her, intending to cut her down. But she laughed at my words and my intention to mock, crying, Come to heel, you hound. Alas for the past, which will never be repeated, nor will anyone be able to raise the dead. Allah has indeed given into my hand him who did this to me, a deed that has burned my heart with a fire that will not die and a flame that will not be quenched. Then she stood up and said something to me that I couldn't understand. Because of my egromancy, you had become half stone and half man, and I transformed into what you see, unable to rise or sit, and neither dead nor alive. Furthermore, she ensorcelled the city with all its streets and garths, and she turned the 4 islands into 4 mountains around the tarn whereof thou inquirest, and the citizens of 4 different faiths, Muslim, Nazarene, Jew, and Magian, she transformed into fishes by her enchantments. The Muslims are white, the Magians are red, the Christians are blue, and the Jews are yellow. And every day she tortureth and scourgeth me with 100 stripes, each of which draweth floods of blood and cutteth the skin of my shoulders to strips, and finally she clotheth my upper half with a haircloth and then throweth over them these robes. The young man then shed more tears and began reciting, I bear my lot and fate with patience, O my God, I will bear whatever be my state at these will. They oppress me, they torture me, they make my life a misery, but perhaps heaven's happiness will compensate for my misfortune. Yes, my life is strained by the bane and the hatred of foes, but Mustafa and Murtaza will open heaven's gate for me. O youth, thou hast removed one grief only to add another grief, but now, O my friend, where is she, and where is the mausoleum wherein lieth the wounded slave? The Sultan said to the young prince. The young guy said, The slave lies under that dome, and she is seated in the room in front of that entrance. Every day at daylight, she emerges and first strips me before whipping me 100 times with a leather scourge. I scream and cry out in pain, but I am powerless to use my lower limbs to fend her off. She visits the slave after she has finished torturing me, giving him wine and boiling foods. By Allah, O lad, I will certainly perform thee a good deed which the world shall not readily let die, and an act of daring do which shall be documented long after I am dead and gone by, said the king. And tomorrow at an early hour she will be here. The king then put him by the young prince's side and conversed with him until nightfall, when he lay down and dozed. However, as soon as the false dawn appeared, he awoke, took off his outer clothing, bared his sword, and hurried to the location where the slave was lying. When he became aware of lit candles and lamps, as well as the scent of incense and other odors, he made for the slave and struck him once, instantly killing him. He then hoisted the slave onto his back and hurled him into a well within the palace. After returning, he put on the slave's clothing and spread within the mausoleum while keeping the drawn sword near to and by his side. After about an hour, the cursed witch arrived. She went to her husband first, stripped him of his clothing, and mercilessly whipped him as he yelled out, Ah! Enough for me the condition I'm in. Take pity on me, O my cousin. But she said, Take pity on me, O my cousin. She then pulled the prayer shawl over his wounded, oozing skin, flung the robe about everyone, and walked down to the slave holding a cup of wine and a bowl of beef broth, asking, Didst thou have pity on me and save the life of my dear love on whom I coated? Well away. And sobbing, O my lord. Give a word to me. O my master. Talk sometime with me. She entered beneath the dome before starting to recite these couplets. How long will this harshness and lack of affection endure? Does it suffice to mention the floods you've seen? You purposefully delay our separation, and if doing so would make my enemy happy, you'd be happy. She cried again and said, My lord, please speak to me and have a conversation with me. The king spoke in a lower tone and, twisting his tongue, spoke in the manner of the people of the land and said, There is no power or authority except in Allah, the glorious and the great. When she heard these words, she was overjoyed and collapsed, losing consciousness. When she regained her senses, she asked, My lord, is it really true that you can speak? The king spoke in a soft and weak voice, answering, My lady, do you really deserve for me to speak and have a conversation with you? Why is that? She asked, to which he replied, It is because you torment your husband all day long and he keeps crying out for help until he can't sleep at night. He prays and curses both of us, causing me distress and a lot of trouble. If it wasn't for that, I would have regained my health a long time ago, and that is the reason why I can't respond to you." She said, "With your permission, I will break the spell that is on him." The king said, "Break it and let's have some peace." She said, "I will obey." And then she went from the tomb to the palace, took a metal bowl, filled it with water and spoke certain words over it, making the water bubble and boil like a pot on the fire. Then she sprinkled the water on her husband and said, "By the power of the words I have spoken, if you were transformed by my spell, return to your original form." Suddenly, the young man began to shake and tremble. Then he stood up and, overjoyed at being freed, exclaimed, "I bear witness that there is no deity but God and that Muhammad is his messenger. May God bless and protect him." She then said to him, "Leave and never come back, or I will kill you." She shouted these words at him. So he left and she returned to the dome, and as she went down to the tomb, she said, "My lord, come out so I can see you in your beauty." The king replied in a soft, low voice, "What have you done? You have removed the branch but not the root." She asked, "My darling, what is the root?" He replied, "Shame on you, my lady. The people of this city and the 4 islands every night when it's halfway through, raise their heads from the tank where you turn them into fish and cry out to heaven, calling for its wrath upon me and you. And this is the reason why my body is prevented from recovering." He said, "You must go immediately and free them, then come back to me and help me stand up, as some of my strength has returned." When she heard the king's words, still thinking he was a slave, she exclaimed joyfully, "My master, your command is my duty, in the name of God." She quickly stood up, full of happiness, and ran down to the pond, took some of its water in her hand, and Shahrazad noticed the sunrise and stopped her story. When it was the 9th night, the young sorceress, as the story goes, picked up some of the tarn water and recited unintelligible words. This caused the fish to suddenly rise up and take on human form, breaking the spell that had been placed on the city's inhabitants. After the sorceress performed her magic, the lake was once again bustling with activity, as people went about their business in the crowded capital. The markets were filled with buyers and sellers, and everyone was busy with their own work. The 4 hills became islands again, as they had been before. The young woman, the wicked sorceress, then went back to the king and, still thinking he was the black slave, said to him, "Oh my love, please extend your hand so I can help you stand up." The king, feigning weakness, replied, "Come closer to me." As she approached him as if to embrace him, the king grabbed the sword hidden by his side and struck her across the chest, the blade protruding from her back. He then struck her again, cutting her in half and throwing her body to the ground. After that, he went outside and found the young man, who had been freed from the spell, waiting for him. He congratulated him on his release and the young man thanked him profusely, kissing his hand. The king asked the young man, "Will you stay in the city or come with me to my capital?" The young man replied, "O king, do you not know how far away your city is? A year's journey for a strong walker." The king said, "It only took me 2.5 days to get here." The young man said, "If you were asleep, O king, wake up. The city was under an enchantment that allowed you to travel here so quickly." The young man said, "I will never leave you, not even for a moment." The king was overjoyed and said, "Thank God for giving you to me. From this day on, you are my son, my only son, as I have never had any children." They hugged each other and were filled with great joy. When they arrived at the palace, the prince who had been under the spell informed his nobles and officials that he intended to go on a pilgrimage to the holy sites, and ordered them to prepare everything necessary for the journey. The preparations took 10 days, after which he set out with the king, who longed to return to his city after being away for a full year. They traveled with a group of Mamelukes and carried all kinds of valuable gifts and rare items. They did not stop traveling day and night for a full year until they were near the king's capital, and they sent messengers ahead to announce their arrival. Then the vizier and the entire army came out to greet them with joy and happiness, as they had given up hope of ever seeing their king again. The troops bowed down before him and congratulated him on his safe return. He entered and sat on his throne and the minister came before him. When he was informed of all that had happened to the young prince, he congratulated him on his narrow escape. After things were settled in the kingdom, the king gave gifts to many of his people. He then said to the vizier, "Bring me the fisherman who gave us the fish." The fisherman was brought before him, as he was the one who caused the city and its inhabitants to be freed from the enchantment. The king gave him the robe of honor and asked about his situation and if he had any children. The fisherman told the king that he had 2 daughters and a son. The king then summoned them and took one of the daughters as his wife, gave the other to the young prince and made the son his chief treasurer. In addition, he appointed his vizier as the ruler of the city in the Black Islands, which had previously belonged to the young prince, and sent him off with an escort of 50 armed slaves, as well as robes of honor for all the emirs and nobles. The vizier accepted the appointment and set off on his journey. Meanwhile, the king and the prince lived happily at home and the fisherman became the wealthiest man of his time. His daughters married kings and they lived until they passed away. But, O king, this story is not more remarkable than the story of